Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Treatment-Free Beekeeping Podcast. Today, I have a special treat. I have on with me Jacqueline Freeman. She is the author of a book called Song of Increase. I went up to visit her and her group this last year and did a talk, which you have heard a few episodes back. I think it's somewhere in the mid to late 30s. I think the talk was called "Let Them Die." It's my catchy title for what treatment-free beekeeping is. So, hang on a couple seconds. We'll get to that as quickly as possible. I'm doing a couple of touring. I'm doing some touring. I sound like I'm a musician or a comedian or something, but it is true. I will be doing some events. The next one will be a Skype presentation next Thursday, a week from Thursday night at the Mecklenburg County Beekeepers Association, I think. I shouldn't say whatever. That's so unprofessional. And then beyond that, I'll be in Oracle, Arizona at D. Lesby's Beekeeping Conference here at the end of the month. So that's going to be a lot of fun. I really enjoyed that last year. And then there's a few more after that. I won't go through all of them. You can find all that information at the Facebook page. Just search for Treatment-Free Beekeepers on Facebook, and you can find that. I think you can even read it without being a member, so you don't have to. If you don't want to, you don't have to become a member. But if you do want to become a member, that gives you access to a huge group of people. We have 13,500 people now. This episode is brought to you by the patrons at patreon.com. If you would like to support the podcast and make sure that it gets as many episodes published as possible, go sign up there to become a supporter. What else? You've heard all the addresses for all the things before. If you want to find out more stuff to do with treatment-free beekeeping, just go listen to some previous episodes. There's all the information. If you haven't listened to previous episodes, go back and listen to them. There's a lot of really good ones. During this episode here, I mentioned a couple like the Lyons Hive and the poly hives that I've talked about in previous episodes. So go back and check those out. You can find all the episodes. You don't need iTunes or any podcatcher or anything. You just need a computer or a phone with internet access. Go to tfb.podbean.com. You can get the entire catalog of episodes and you can play them right off the webpage. So, I will get out of your way now, and here is Jacqueline Freeman. Welcome, Jacqueline. We met a while back. I guess you were scheduled to go to the D. Lesby's conference last year, and you couldn't make it, and so you sent somebody else. And then I heard about your materials from there, and then we got connected, and I came up and spoke for your group, and then learned about your book. And am I right there?
That's it. Yeah.
Usually when I have a guest on, we start off with just a little bit of background about yourself, kind of tell us your beekeeping story and how you got into this and your kind of core philosophies, and just feel free to tell us everything you want.
That's a nice invitation. I started with bees about 13, 14 years ago. I have a farm. We bought this, maybe it's a little longer than that even. We bought the farm 16 years ago. And so in my second year here on the farm, I got bees, not through any intention to get bees. A friend of mine in Portland, downtown, had a friend who bought a house, and there were some bees out in the woods in the backyard, and they didn't want them there anymore. Or they didn't want them there when they moved in. So she asked if, actually she didn't really even ask. She said, "You have a farm, you should have bees." And I said, "Yeah, that sounds like a good idea." So we went and got a bunch of bees. Oh my God, we were dressed like the hazmat suits to the max. We had duct tape around everything that had a fold or a crease in it. It was just funny. We wrapped the whole the whole thing up, the whole hive up in garbage bags and ropes, and I don't know what we were thinking. That's how new people are around bees, and I guess we weren't any different. So I had bees. I was fascinated with them from like day one, and I bought a bee suit so I'd have something to protect me from them. And I used to go down there every afternoon. I'd go down there and sit for, I'd say I was going for 20 minutes, and I'd be down there 3 hours, and I would just sit with them. And it was really interesting because the more I sat with them, the more I realized, the bees are not out to get you. They have extremely little interest in me anyway. And they just, came and went and came and went. And, over time, and it took a while, but over time I eventually, stopped doing the duct tape around my tall rubber boots and all that. And, eventually got to the part where I could sit with wearing a t-shirt and shorts and sneakers and, not be as freaked out. I think I kept my veil on for a long time. This, by the way, did not happen over like 3 weeks or anything like that. This happened over a much longer period of time until I think, I don't know, maybe by the time I was in my maybe 5th, 6th, 7th year, I'm not sure when. By that time I was collecting swarms and I wasn't wearing any equipment at all, just plain old regular, whatever I had on that day. And that really, it took a while. I didn't know you could even do that, but it was just, especially gathering swarms, which was a thing for me. Sometimes I just wasn't ready and prepared. So it ended up being, I don't have the gloves. I guess I'll have to do it without them. My first year keeping bees, I had 2 hives. They both didn't make it through the winter, although they did throw off swarms and went off into the woods around our farm. So their genetics stayed here. And the second year, I collected 45 swarms. Back then, in the good old golden days of beekeeping, back then, there was hardly anybody out there catching swarms. So I think I put it up on Craigslist or whatever one would have done way back then, and got a ton of calls and learned really quickly how to do that. It was swarms and cutouts. I did 45 calls that year. So it was that was really an amazing adventure, and it was just marvelous to learn so much about really what bees are like in the wild when we were doing the cutouts, and opening up like the sides of barns and things like that I could see this is how bees are when you give them just, when they take space, not related to me putting a laying out there and seeing what they do. Well, of course, they're going to be quite predictable. But, boy, I learned a whole lot. My husband and I went and collected bees from things like a big willow tree split in half in a storm, and half the trunk fell over, and, it was full of comb. And wow, that was one of the first times I got to see inside a tree what truly wild bees look like. And, they'd probably been in there, I don't know, 20 years, 30 years, long time before the homeowner even bought their home. And just seeing all that natural stuff going on in there was so thrilling to me. I moved from Langs my first year. I think in my 3rd year, I moved over to Juarez. And then by my 5th or 6th year, I started doing some top bars. And then, of course, we get calls for when someone cuts down a tree and then all of a sudden finds out there's bees in it. Then we've gone and picked up a few trees that way with the bees still in them and brought them home. So I've got a real range of different kinds of hives. And then, of course, we have the forest around us where we do find bees in trees as well, and probably from my own swarms. I am somebody who believes that swarming is really important to the health of the hive, so my hives do swarm. And that's probably, let me see, a little bit more on my background. A few years ago, probably 6-7 years ago, before that, I used to sit with my hives all the time, and almost daily. It was just, I would go out and sit with them. Solomon, how many years ago did you start with bees?
I started in 2003.
Yeah, so around the same time that I started. Back then, it was really hard to find information on, this is an organic and a biodynamic farm that my husband and I have. We don't use any chemicals. So it seemed absolutely silly to me that I would use chemicals on my bees, and yet everything that I was trying to find for information was saying, here's all the chemicals you apply. And I just couldn't do that. So I kind of felt out on my own being treatment-free. I've been treatment-free since day one. And except for one little, I think year 3, I tried some essential oils. One time I had a small swarm I'd collected, and they had mites on them, and I read that was helpful, and it was an organic solution. I thought, well, maybe I could just stretch a little bit. And I put some, what is the oil that you put in? Do you remember? You probably wouldn't know either because we don't do treatments. But I put in
Thymol, maybe?
Yeah, that's it, thyme oil. I put some thyme oil on some paper towels and laid them across the top of the hive, and then I watched through the observation windows, and the bees just freaked out. They were running everywhere, and I mean, it was just, and I thought, wow, this is so strong for me to smell even. I can't even imagine what it's like for a bee in there. And I couldn't do it. After a short period of time, I opened it up and took it out and apologized to them. Anyway, I spent a lot of years saying, I will do anything to take care of you the best way possible, but you got to give me some help here because I don't really know what I'm doing, and there's no place for me to ask, and I can't find old-fashioned beekeepers who aren't using chemicals. And anyway, and then one morning when I was in bed and I was kind of in this little half meditative state before you're fully awake, I just got some information about the bees that just popped into my head. And I wrote it down. It was something I didn't know. And I said, wow, where do you think that came from? And that happened on a pretty regular basis it still does. I just kind of get this information about bees. So I'm kind of like I guess a bee psychic. I'm not sure what I'd really call myself. I know it's more what other people would call it. I just get messages from the bees, and they seem to be pretty tied in. And my book, Song of Increase, is based on those teachings I got from the bees. I know it sounds kind of funny, but, all through science, stuff like this happens, so I'm kind of going to go with that. I think it happened because I asked, and I asked sincerely and deeply for so many years, and then one day they said, give it to her. And so what I found is, even since my book has been printed, a few of the things that I had in there, now they've done studies and shown them to be true. So it's kind of confirming anyway. So that's probably about my bee history. I'm finding myself going more and more over to old ways. Keeping bees in trees is something I just totally love.
Well, just for some background information real quick, you live in southern Washington, just a bit north of Portland, correct?
Yes, I do.
Just give us a quick overview of what your typical weather is like there, and then we'll talk about the book.
Okay, 6 months of the year, it rains, it's drizzly, or it's gray. And every once in a while, in a week between October and June, say November and June, we get a little spot of sunshine here and there. It doesn't tend to be too cold. I mean, we've been through 16 years we've had our farm here. Only 3 or 4 winters has it even snowed. So we typically will get some frosts, but we don't usually get anything that's cold for an extended period of time. This year we did. We had about a week where it was below freezing much of the time. But that's kind of unusual for us. So it's kind of like UK, a lot of gray and drizzle, and yeah, it gets cold in the winter, but it doesn't freeze over and get snowy.
I like to talk about location a bit with every guest, so that just to reinforce the idea that beekeeping is local and that different conditions will lead to different beekeeping practices, and that people shouldn't take their individual locations for granted, and that advice that they get from beekeepers in other places in the world may not be 100% applicable. So I just like to reinforce that point.
That's interesting, too, because our weather is not, most people know in the Pacific Northwest it rains and drizzly. They know that part of it. What they don't know is starting in July and all the way to the middle of October, we could easily go 100 days with no rain. The rain just shuts off like a faucet shutting off in your garden, and that's it. And a lot of summers we've had, hardly a bit of rain at all. So when we come off of the flow, we really come off the flow hard and fast. In August, there's just not that much in bloom. September, we don't have that many late summer and fall flowers. So here on the farm, what I do is we have acreage. So, last year I put in a half an acre of sunflowers, and I timed them to come out right about that time, end of August and carrying through into September. Because I need them to have something to forage from. And by the way, I do want to bring up something that I feel pretty strongly about, too. I think if you're a beekeeper, you really ought to be a gardener. And I'm surprised so many people keep bees without ever thinking really of the forage that's out there and what they can do to increase it. It's kind of saddling the bees with going out and finding stuff. And here on our farm, I really try to speak to the weakest season for the bees, which is late summer, early fall. And always have things that are blooming around that time, so that for one thing, it stops up the robbing. My bees in the fall. In my early days with them, I had robbing. I've got a number of hives, and there was nothing to go for, so the weaker hives were just getting robbed out pretty consistently. There's a few things I do now to prevent robbing. One of them is I spread my hives out more. They're spread across the farm. And also, I make sure they've got something to be foraging for. That really helps a lot. And the third kind of robbing is, when you get attacked by the Yellowjackets, I do as thorough as I can run on Yellowjacket queens. In about another month, I'll start doing that, making sure I can collect as many with those pheromone traps so that I don't have that kind of robbing later in the summer either.
That's a good point. I think not enough people know about is that when you see Yellowjackets early in the year, those are almost all queens. And so by eliminating Yellowjackets at that time, each individual Yellowjacket, hornet, wasp, whatever you want to call it, that you eliminate at that time eliminates an entire nest later in the year.
Man, and that's like knocking off, what is it? I don't even know how many, 5 to 50,000. Who knows how many are down there? But yeah, that's the easy way. I used to go around looking for, where are they coming from? Now I look for, who's going to originate this line of them? And yep, I do. I have a thing. I'm not real keen on killing much of anything, but Yellowjacket queens are on the other side of the line for me. I've heard that the Yellowjackets really have a limited forage area, that it's usually about 500 feet from wherever they nest. They're pretty much their range. So I know for where my hives are, they're located right in the center of my 10 acres. Those Yellowjackets are probably on my land, or at least really, really close by. So yeah, I get those pheromone traps. They seem to work pretty good. I'm always surprised by how many Yellowjackets I have in them. The other thing I do is, we have outbuildings with shingles, and I look at that as well, up under the edges of the shingles and things like that. Are there any queens? Are they in the outbuildings? They'll sometimes winter over, and I'll see them just drowsy and starting to wake up by sunny window panes. Like, oh, cool, you're a goner. So, yeah, that's a really good thing for this time of year for people to start thinking about.
That's interesting. I hadn't heard that they had such a limited range.
Yeah, isn't that a surprise? So, and it seems to work. I should be knocking on wood as I say this, but I haven't had problems with Yellowjackets the last few years since I started that program, and it starts in March around here.
Well, for people who are interested, I have seen Yellowjacket traps now available in stores, so if you want to get ahead of that, it's a pretty good idea to do that right now. By the time you start seeing Yellowjackets attacking your hives, it is really honestly too late. By that time, they're already making the next year's queens. So now's the time to do it, and later on is not really useful.
Yeah, boy, because it sounds like you've done the same thing I've done, standing in front of the hive trying to swat away the Yellowjackets. They're going to keep on coming all day. There's no way I can get ahead of them. I saw an interesting thing with one of my hives once. I had a day in my earlier years. I had a day where 3 of my hives were getting hit by Yellowjackets at the same time. It was just, murderous. And I had 2 of the hives I could take care of. I was reasonably close to where they were, and I was standing there with a tongue depressor at the front door, squishing them as they went in. It was okay. I managed to help those 2 hives, and it did okay. The 3rd hive, I didn't help out because they were my strongest hive. And I thought, if I can only pick 1 or 2 out of these 3, I'm going to leave the strong one. It was a bad mistake on my part. I'm going to leave the strong one and I'll go help the other guys. Well, this strong hive, they were in a top bar, and they did a really interesting thing. I had 3 holes as entrances. They were about, maybe like an inch across. And while the Yellowjackets were hitting them, and I was, running between the hives, not knowing quite really what to do, these 3 entrance holes, the Yellowjackets were hitting them hard, and all of a sudden the bees from the inside just came up with propolis and sealed the holes right off. I had a dual entrance. I had a entrance at the back of the hive underneath that apparently the Yellowjackets didn't know about. But it didn't take them, 10 minutes, just a short period of time. It was amazing for me to see them actually do it. I was on the outside trying to squash here and there, and all of a sudden 1 hole sealed, next hole sealed, and there goes the 3rd hole.
That's awesome. I've never seen that in person. I've seen the results of it. I've had plenty of times where hives will close off entrances, even large entrances. They will close off mostly if they want to, but I've never seen them actually in the process like that.
Well, if I hadn't been there for those 10 minutes, I would have missed it. I've got some hives right now who are front entrance closers, and in this time of year, I always used to go around in the fall and put a little, an entrance reducer on the front of the hives. And the problem with the entrance reducers, though, is if it's cold, great. But as soon as the weather starts to warm up and the bees all want to come out and do a little poop run, I got to be there to move that entrance reducer back, or I got a flurry of bees, kind of tangled up at the front entrance because the entrance is too tiny then. So what I've noticed is a few years ago, I got a hive that all of a sudden they took care of their own front entrance. They sealed off the entire thing. They put, I call it an apron, all the way along the whole entrance. So that's like about 1 foot long. And the apron has 3 or 4 little holes that are about the size of 1 bee. And then up at the north side of the apron, they have a little entrance that is probably maybe an inch or less. And they open and close that at will. And that's so cool because I don't have to be there to do it. And I'm usually not there at the exact right time to move the reducer out anyway. Because I let my bees swarm, the hive that's next to them now, this year, learned how to do the same apron. And that just tickles me so much that, somebody released a drone out of that first hive that went up and found the queen that went back to that second hive. And now that information about apron building got passed along. So I'm hoping eventually all of my bees know how to do that.
That sounds great. One of the downsides that I've found with entrance reducers is when you put them on, there's going to be a little bit of confusion, and that's not that big of a deal. But one of the things I've found is that when you take them off, the bees don't really, for several days at least, they don't really know what's going on there. And so the bees will keep coming and going from that same spot that they were, and there won't be any guard bees on the other spots that were previously blocked off, and that can lead to robbing.
I have seen that same thing, and it's what's leading me away from using the entrance reducers and trusting that the bees will handle it. Now, I've got a lang where they haven't done that. It's just wide open, and geez, I waited until, it was really cold and windy. And I was like, oh, man, okay, I'll put a reducer on here. But I don't seem to have some of the problems other people have, like mice. I have very active cats up in our fields, so I haven't had to worry about that. And I know some people will put them on just to keep the mice from getting in.
Tell us about what kind of hives you're running right now.
Well, a little bit of everything. Golden mean top bar hives that I got from Corwin Bell at what's his website? backyardhive.com. I like his hives a whole lot. They're well made, and really you can buy them in a kit, or you can put them together. You can buy them all put together. So I've had those for a while. I made it since you brought up hives, and I do have Juarez, and I do have tree hives, and I've got a Lang. Mostly I have a Lang because I teach, and I feel like even though that's not the one I'm familiar with, I should have a little bit of everything here. I'm going to also say that advice for new beekeepers, one of the biggest mistakes I made was in the beginning when I started spreading out from just having the Langs, and I started trying other different kinds of hives, that everything I have until just recently didn't match anything else. So if I ever wanted to say, oh, strong hive here, oh, this hive could use a little bit of brood comb or some honey for the winter, none of my bars were tradable. And that's just plain silly. If I had any one thing that I could do over again from the beginning, I would pick a kind of a hive and make sure that everything matched and was interchangeable. So that's a direction that finally in my 14, 15 year, that's the direction I'm moving in now is let's just keep carrying on with hives that match. So I've got a bunch of top bars that I'm trying to make sure that I stick to that. The problem was that we made some people traded me for some people made some. It was, they came from so many different places that nothing at all matched. Even my Juarez didn't match each other. So yeah, that was a lesson learned.
I am in full agreement with that concept.
Man, you get, if you have one kind of hive, then you have a little pile of spare equipment. When you've got 15 different kinds of hives, and I'm exaggerating a little bit, my pile of spare equipment is big. So yeah, that's anybody that's a newer beekeeper listening, follow that piece of advice for sure.
Yes, that's a big piece of advice that I give. Pick one and go with it. In fact, one of the concepts that I'm developing right now for my book, which will be out later, we'll talk about it some other time, is when you start beekeeping, not only just pick one type of hive, but pick a model to go with. If someone likes the way you keep bees, then they should follow what you do as fully as they can until they learn how to come up with their own practices. If they like me, or if they like Michael Bush, or Kirk Webster, or anybody whose path they want to follow in beekeeping, that's what they should do, rather than try and pick out things cafeteria style. Because while cafeteria style is fine, you need to know what the food tastes like before you start picking. What I'm saying is that a new beekeeper doesn't have the framework from which to decide cafeteria style what they're going to do.
Yeah, you have no rhyme or reason why you're picking this. Yeah. And now I'm really picky about stuff. I like certain things. I don't like other stuff at all. And I've kind of been through the gamut of that to settle in on it. And I find that too now, that with people who take my classes, that, it's kind of try it this way for a while. Just go for a few years like this. And then you'll know enough to start making your own decisions. Susan Chernak McElroy did that with me. She kind of became my apprentice for about 5 years and just did whatever I was doing, she just did. Now she's off on her own making skeps out of straw.
Yes, I've seen some of the pictures that she's posted on the Facebook group.
She's been having a wonderful time. But, she's got the background now to be able to know what she's doing, even as she's entering into a new thing. If she tried that in her second year, I don't think it would have worked out as well. So I'm immensely proud of her.
Well, let's talk about what you have available for classes and the types of things that you teach, and how people can get your materials and things.
Well, everything we do is on my website, spiritbee.com. And for classes, Susan's teaching a lot of the beginner classes now, and we have there's actually three different things going on there. First of all, Susan teaches the beginner classes. I teach more of the advanced classes, and in springtime, I teach a few swarm catching classes, how to do swarms in bait hives and cutouts, which I'm really fond of, and I have great fun doing it. It was kind of nice to have Susan coming up behind me that way, because she's a accomplished speaker and author anyway, so she knew how to handle a class, and it kind of let me go off onto what are the parts I enjoyed the most. So I've been doing that. So the beginner classes are there, the more advanced classes and the swarm catching stuff is there. My book is on there, obviously, and then we just formed a club called Preservation Beekeeping that we're just getting started with. And what we're doing is we're kind of creating a different model. And it's so interesting because I'm seeing parallels with this like all over Europe and different places where it's kind of like, you get that 100th monkey thing when a bunch of you get the same idea at the same time. We're looking to keep bees in ways they've been kept successfully in the past, but that isn't all we're interested in. We're also, and that's part of what Susan's doing with her skeps, is looking at, how did this succeed so well for so long? But my part of it is I'm real interested in tree hives, and I've worked with a lot of tree hives now. And so this year we've got a few tree hives that we've moved onto the farm, and we've got a few wild ones. So this year we're going to start making more, and I'll probably give a class on it this summer, classes on how to actually make tree hives. These will be truly your wild hives. These, the direction we're going in really is we're just not concerned about honey gathering at all. I just realized, for all these years, how much honey we eat in a year, it's just not really worth doing a whole lot that way. I still have my hives. I still have losses every once in a while, and I can always gather the honey from that. And I do gather some honey usually fairly early in the season, kind of after spring's over and when we're going into the flow. So I've got plenty enough honey anyway. So the rest of the bees around here, I'm going to be putting into maybe another top bar or two, but mostly trees. And that fulfills some of the stuff Tom Seeley talks about the spread of bees, how in the wild bees live far apart from each other. They don't all live in an apiary, kind of crammed up close. They live spread out, and that's one of the things I'm hoping to give them, their own territories back again, where bees can be bees. So this club that we're doing, Preservation Beekeeping, it's open to anybody. We've got a website called, surprisingly, preservationbeekeeping.com, and I think we just got that up this week. So it's kind of nice you asked me this week, Solomon, because I actually have something to say about that.
Is there anything else you want to say about that?
Anybody that wants to come play with us is welcome to. We're kind of going along as we're learning about it. And we're having a lot of communication with the European beekeepers about it. I have an article in this month's Natural Bee Husbandry. And I think Tom Seeley and I are the only two Americans that are in the magazine. All the rest of them are European. And we're just finding a lot of parallels with what we're seeking to do and what they're doing at the same time. So that's really kind of fun for us.
Outstanding.
Yeah.
I'm really getting interested in tree hives also, or at least log hives anyway. I regularly drive by a firewood. What would be there's a place in town here where they process firewood and they sell firewood. And it seems like they haul in these trees from all over the area, and the big trees, maybe 3 feet in diameter that have a hollow center, they don't seem to use. They throw them on the scrap pile and just burn them. So
that's just what I'm looking for too. I just got one the other day, and riding down the highway, I'm just keeping my eyes looking all the time for, is there anything? And I saw a guy the other day on the side of the road about 5 miles from me. He was 60 feet up in a tree, and he was cutting down an old black locust. And boy, I was pull over. So I came home with a big log. Yeah, that's really fun. When you a few years ago, I got invited to go to the Dominican Republic on a USDA grant to work with really rural beekeepers to help them. They were interested in people who were doing treatment-free stuff. So Mikhail Teely and I went down and spent some time way back in the jungle mountains there. And what I saw there was so wonderful. They really ran their bees. They've had bees there since the 1500s, and they run their bees in the modern ones have langs, but the old school ones keep them in logs. They're a horizontal log set up on a crossbar, so it's about 3 feet off the ground, just like a top bar would be, and then got spales going all the way through. Sometimes a lot of them didn't even have spales to build comb on. The bees just built the whole round circle. And then they have a banana leaf over the end of each log. The logs were about, I'd say probably 3 to 4 feet long. And they actually could harvest honey from them. The honey was on the outside edges. So they would just reach in and peel back a few of the hanging combs. And when I asked them about it, I said, for some of them, they had Langstroth hives and they had log hives. They said they were strongly encouraged to get rid of those old log hives.
I've just seen recently on YouTube, there are some British beekeepers who are getting back into an old idea where they will climb up a very large old tree and they will hollow out a spot in the heart of the tree for a hive, to put a hive, and then kind of close back up the space again. And then pretty quickly they'll get a swarm settle in there. And that is one of the methods used by British beekeepers throughout the past several centuries that has died out lately. And by lately, I mean within the last 100 or 200 years. Yeah,
isn't that amazing? I saw those same things. That's the classes we're going to teach this summer, where we haven't done it yet, but I have friends who've done it, and we'll probably have Mikhail Teely come up and help with it because he's made some of them. And then my friends Ferry and the other guys who were over there in Europe, I've been watching those, and I'm just so intrigued. And the tree continues living. That's what I didn't understand before. It's like, I always figured a tree was on its way out by the time it had bees in it. But they said, no, the tree keeps living. The phylum comes up, the outside of the hive, the outside of the tree. So the tree goes long, can go another 60, 70 years even, they said. How cool is
We have a lot of our main native tree here in the drier areas here in Southern Oregon. We have similar weather to you in the spring, fall, and winter, but in the summer we have, it's the same in the summer as well with a long dry period, only our dry period is much, much longer. So we get, depending on the soil types, we get large areas with oak trees, which have grown there for a lot of these oak trees are big enough to be several hundred years old. Not all of them, but they are available. And so we find these trees, a lot of the old, like the ones that have been pointed out to me from older people like my grandparents, or these old oak trees that are maybe 3 feet in diameter, and they had bee colonies in them at various points throughout history, and they lived for many decades having this big hollow in the middle of the tree. And so, the idea that a tree has to be dead or on its way out is not necessarily accurate.
Yeah, that's so cool. You get hotter weather down where you are. You're further south than me, so you actually get up in the 90s and stuff, right?
Well, we actually have been, I think the record is somewhere above 110, but usually we'll get up to 100, 5 or 10 days a year.
Wow. Well, see, one of the things I've noticed with my bees, the ones that are in trees, first of all, if they're in trees, we put bees in these little thin-skinned hives, like, all the hives I've got, from Warrays to top bars to Langs. It's half-inch lumber. It's not that thick. And yet, when I've seen these tree hives opened up, that's like, it could be 4 inches thick. Just the thermal insulation of that tree perimeter really provides the capacity for the bees to maintain their temperature and keep it exactly where they want, winter or summer. I read recently that some of the pictures they'd taken of the videos of bees inside tree hives in the wintertime, that the bees don't actually go into torpor like they do for, we just think that's common in cold weather. The bees kind of go into that semi-hibernation. But when it's thermally thick, they're very relaxed, calm, and quiet. They're not eating a lot of their stores because they're not. That was the first thing I thought of was, they'll eat up all their honey real quick. Well, they're not, because they're not having to make heat. They're just maintaining a level of heat that's easily maintained in the inside of a tree that's that thermally insulated. It's really made me think about the insulation we provide around the hives, And I notice this too, because I'll watch these bees that are in the trees coming in and out of their hive, and the level of activity, and when you get really hot weather, you can tell the bees, they get testy, they get a little frantic even, because they've got to lower the temperature, which sometimes seems like it's even more difficult than raising the temperature in the winter. And I noticed that my beehives that are in the trees, they kind of maintain a status quo. Every day looks like the day before. And it doesn't look like there's a flurry of activity or too little activity. It just stays rather calm. So anyway, that I thought was interesting. I made a big mistake. Here, let's talk about mistakes for a moment. So I got this idea years ago that trees were thicker, so therefore my hive should be thicker. So I had my husband get some, what is it called? Is it dimensional lumber? Lumber where really an inch is an inch?
Right.
Yeah. And I said, make me a Warray hive. Make me 2 Warray hives, but make them out of this dimensional lumber where the sides are really an inch thick. And so he did. And I put these hives together and tucked a swarm into each of them and then let them go. Well, let me tell you, as soon as it came time for me to switch one box, you know how you switch a Warray, you pick the whole thing up. You take the top box off, you pick the whole thing up, and you put a new fresh box underneath. Well, get a little bit of honeycomb in those things. And, a full Lang box of honey, a full Langstroth with honey, and it can be, 60, 80 pounds?
A deep can be upwards of 90 pounds.
Yeah, I've heard even that high. Well, let me tell you, fill up a Warray with like 3 boxes that you got to lift up. Oh, my God. It must have weighed 250 pounds. I couldn't. Normally, Joseph and I have a sweet little routine. I take the box off the top. He picks up maybe the 2 bottom boxes together, and I slide another one underneath. The 2 of us can do that, and it takes us, a minute and a half. With these big, heavy Warrays made with dimensional lumber to keep the bees warm all winter, well, I made a big mistake, 250 pounds. He can't lift that up by himself, so I had to wait until somebody large would come and visit someday, and I'd go, hey, I've got an extra large bee suit here. Could you come help us do this? Didn't matter if they had any bee experience or not, but I found that to be to my downfall because those hives, they're movable, but they're really not movable. Now I'm treating them just like they're a tree because they're just too heavy for me to do anything with. So it was a good idea. It had bad execution.
There's actually what you report with the bees being much more efficient with their honey usage and heating is the same sort of report that I've heard from people using artificially insulated hives, the styrofoam hives that are available, and they are reporting the same thing.
Ha! Isn't that nice? I have no experience with that, but I think we're going off in the same direction there.
Have you heard of the Lyons Hive?
What kind? Say it again.
Lyons, Layens.
No, don't know anything about that one.
It's made out of 2x lumber, so 1.5 inches thick, and I think they use like 2 1x10s stacked on top of each other, and then anyway, so it's a trough hive essentially, and it's a combination top bar hive also. So the bars the bars are full width like a top bar hive, so you take the lid off and the bees aren't exposed to the air. But those top bars also have a frame built on them, so it's kind of a cross between a top bar hive and a frame hive. And so it's all in one big box, which is not movable. So anyway, I did an episode on the podcast a few months back about that. I was wondering if you had any experience with those.
No, I hadn't, and I missed that podcast. I'll have to go listen. That's interesting. That's kind of the direction I'm interested in, is, these alternative hives that let the bees have more responsibility for their own management and less human responsibility for it. We tinker too much, and we don't always know what we're doing when we're tinkering, and that's often to the detriment of the bees. I'm much more of a hands-off beekeeper. I spend, 10 times more time observing my bees than I ever do doing anything to them.
Maybe people should spend more time observing their bees rather than talking about them on the internet.
Touché. That's a good one.
There's another thought that I had while you were talking. The Langstroth hive is really a hive that is optimized for pollination, and pollination is a warm weather activity, and hives generally employed in pollination also often spend their winters down in southern states so that they can be ready for almond pollination in the spring. So what we're dealing with Langstroth hives is a hive that's not at all optimized for cooler weather, and yet it's the hive that has reached near universal application.
And I think the forklift aspect of it is really one reason. They're just so easy to transport. But yeah, I don't know. I'm just not drawn to doing the langs. I did them my first few years, and like I said, I've got one lang here that I keep really just as a demonstration model. But other than that, I'm not a lang girl. I'm more of any of the other ones.
That's a good point. I've been teaching for years and years that you're not a migratory commercial beekeeper, so don't keep bees like a migratory commercial beekeeper. So that might be interpreted in the future as more of an admonition to move away from that standard type hive and move into other types of hives that require less maintenance and are more healthy for the bees overall.
Yep, I think that's a really good point and worth saying. Mm-hmm.
Well, let's talk about your book. I'll admit I haven't had the opportunity to read it yet. It's called Song of Increase. It's recently been reprinted and updated from your original book. So why don't you tell us what that's all about?
Well, a year and a half ago, I came out with a book called The Song of Increase, with the THE on the front of it. The Song of Increase, and the returning to sacred. Oh gosh, I can't believe I've forgotten. But returning to our sacred connection with honeybees, or something like that. Anyway, I put it out for just a few months, and it kind of took off, and it just kind of was selling on every continent. It was just a self-published book on Amazon, and it ended up having 3 publishers did a little bidding war to get the rights to publish it. And so it came on the market just for a few months, and then went off the market so that I could go through a professional editing process with the new company. My old one was called returning to our sacred partnership with honeybees. And the new book is called Song of Increase, Listening to the Wisdom of Honeybees for Kinder Beekeeping and a Better World. So the second one it's more professional. I'm really happy with the way it came out. It's nothing like working with really good editors. And it's rocking. It's being translated into French right now. The French edition will be out. I mean, this is just crazy hog wild to me that it's doing so well. I find that it's spoken to a lot of people who did not want to do kind of the amateur version of commercial beekeeping. There's a lot of people out there who really want to build a relationship with their bees, and that's what my book is about. It's about really spending time observing them, taking care of them, and even things like sometimes I get, or I'm on a lot of lists, even I'm on your list, as a matter of fact, for discussion about bees, and a lot of people will say things like, my bees, I'm so worried about them, and I think, why worry about them? Why not just go out there and bless them or pray with them or meditate or do anything, but don't worry about them. If somebody was sitting around worrying about me all day, I'd feel like crap about it. So in the book, I talk a lot about the information that the bees shared with me. And I also talk a lot about my own bee stories and about how I've learned different things about bees. Mostly, I think the unique spot that book fills is about learning how to have a relationship with a colony and in the whole bee kingdom in general, how to be heart-centered in everything you do, and how, when you got a question about it, to let the bees make decisions rather than you making possibly wrong decisions. And certainly I've made my share of those. So, and I think I've shared a lot of my errors in beekeeping in there too, that have made me be a better, more sensitive and more caring, compassionate beekeeper. That's really what the essence of it is.
Can you give us the details on one of those stories? Something maybe that you find helps a lot of people?
Yeah, okay. How about swarming? Just to pick one out of thin air. In swarming, first of all, everybody wants to prevent swarming. And I think there are situations where that's appropriate. If you've got bees that you've bought, the ones that are like the commercial bees, what I can call them, and they're not treatment-free and they rely on chemicals and stuff like that, I'm hoping that you don't let those bees swarm, because I don't want those. I don't want those bees out in the general gene pool. Keep those bees home. But for people who have, swarms that are, colonies that are healthy and doing really well, and and you live in areas where swarming is not going to, people are not going to come out and spray those bees with Raid, I encourage it. And one of the things the bees shared with me is that it's actually integral to the success of the fertility of the queens that the swarming happen. I've always been told that, and even the first year when I went to bee school, that you had to replace your queens every year because, and I kept saying, why? That doesn't happen in nature. Why do we have to do that? And everyone that I asked about that said, well, because they lose their fertility. They're not fertile their second year, so you got to replace them after 1 year. That just never felt right to me. And so when I asked the bees about it, what they explained to me was that when the bees come out to do their swarming, that the queen comes out to fly as well. She stays inside that hive year-round, day after day, except for her mating flight. She is never out of that hive, except for swarming day. And when she comes out and flies in the sun for that even brief time, what it does is it turns on her hormones. It exposes her to something that flicks a switch inside of her that guarantees her fertility for another year. So I learned out of that. I've always been a fan of swarming anyway, but I learned that from their perception, that's one of the things that they understand. And so I don't replace my queens every year. I let them swarm, and I rarely have queen failures too. They're healthy, they're happy, they continue on. And I have some that have swarmed. So unless they've done a supersedure, I've got queens that I know that queen. I saw it come out of that hive, and I put it into this hive. So that queen has carried forth for. I've got queens that have lived for 5 years. That's verifiable, and they've been just as fertile in their later years as they were in their early years.
That's good. Without there's a lot of conjecture nowadays about why it seems that queen fertility has gone down, and a lot of people trace that to treatments and a couple of other things, but I hadn't thought of the idea that swarming might be like a reset switch for a queen to give her a new burst of vigor.
Yeah, that's an example of some of the things the bees have shared with me. I never thought of that. That's like, wow, where'd that come from? That's cool. So anyway, it all throughout the book, there's stories from what it's like from their perception. That's what they've shared with me, which is kind of an interesting experience. When I do this, I'm not really kind of woo that way. The experience of it isn't like I do anything magical, or well, maybe it is magical, but it's more like I think of a question and I kind of feel like I'm going to them and asking them. And they don't always answer my questions. Sometimes they just ignore me. Other times they really do send me information that just kind of comes through, and I usually write as fast as I can to get it down. Sometimes when I ask questions, they will give me background information for a day before they actually tell me the answer, and there'll be something that some bigger concept I needed to understand first. And just to address that, by the way, if you've got anybody listening going, what? She talks with bees? That is something that in science, Linus Pauling, who did all the vitamin C research, he actually used to set aside a part of his day every afternoon when he'd sit and just let ideas come through him that way. Tesla did stuff like that. There's a number of scientists who relied on information coming through them, and I guess I got the bee information there.
Well, I don't often speak on philosophical subjects like that, but one of the things that I've been discovering in my own life in the last few years is through my own spiritual discovery is being open to things like that, because in admittedly, there are people who will listen to this and go, yeah, okay. Because I've done that. You're not the first person who speaks with that sort of language. I have a lady named Laura B. who lives around here and teaches in Ashland.
Yep, I know Laura, yeah.
And she talks similar that way too. And so I'm two people who are maybe weirded out by that sort of language. Think about it like this. Our brains are incredibly complex machines, chemical machines. And whether the information comes to us as if we are antennas, or whether the information comes to us from the mechanisms of our brain creating these realities in our minds, it doesn't matter. The information is coming to us, and it is well established throughout history, as you just said, with many different scientists and people who have inspiration come through dreams, through daydreaming, through maybe like the guy who discovered LSD, accidentally touched a test tube. These things, they happen, and we know they happen, and if we can't necessarily explain why they happen through various means, it doesn't really matter. It just matters that they happen. So whether you want to believe that the bees are actually speaking to Jacqueline, or if you want to believe that Jacqueline's brain is making it up, it really doesn't matter. The point is that it's happening.
Yeah, ideas, they have to come from somewhere. And, sometimes I read studies and I'll see interesting things written up in it. I read a lot of studies. And when I read them, sometimes I go, yeah, that's pretty cool. I didn't know about that. Other times, I go, that just doesn't seem right. It doesn't sit right. Like, for example, one of the stories that wasn't in my self-published book but made it into the second one was some information I got in between. And the bees, Thomas Seeley was doing some stuff about the size of feral hives. And the bees had just been talking to me about this just before he wrote his stuff about what is the proper size for a beehive. And they said, actually the way we do it is we pick for dearth years. We don't pick for success years. We pick for the year where we're going to be able to survive when it's bad weather and low forage. So we actually prefer to have a smaller hive rather than a great big large hive. And here I thought all this time when I was putting out my hives and adding boxes that I was doing what they really intended to do. It made me start to think of, and then Thomas came out with one of his studies saying that, the prime hive size was, 5 gallons or something? It was like about half the size that we think is normal. And that was the one that the bees wanted the most, completely confirming what I was getting for the same information. That was kind of cool. And inside of those smaller hives, they can maintain for a longer period as well. So I've started thinking, what if the bees actually are planning for the dearth years, which means when we get a year where there's a lot of honey to harvest, and then we beekeepers all go hog wild and gather as much as we can, leaving just enough to get through the winter. Maybe that was harvested by the bees so that they could have it for 2 years, knowing that this year's going to finish out well, but next year it may not be as strong. So I've really started looking at more things like that, giving the bees credit for having the capacity to plan and run their homes the way that they need to be run.
I think that's one of the problems that having modular hives like Langstroth hives are. One of the problems that it introduces, because when you have that extra honey, we don't really have a mechanism for that hive to store that honey over multiple years. From what I've seen...
and it encourages you to take a whole box or take 2 boxes. It encourages that rather than looking at it. Even in my Warre hives, if I harvest some, I don't necessarily harvest a whole box. I may take 2 bars and leave the rest of it and let them fill in, where my 2 bars used to be.
Right. And actually, if I'm kind of a student of bee people on the internet because of my Facebook group and stuff, now is the time of year when you hear the question, can you harvest honey in the springtime? Because, the bees didn't use all of it last winter, so can I harvest it now? So that's exactly in a wild hive. The honey, as far as I understand it, bees at the end of the winter take stock of what's in the hive, and they decide at that point how they're going to swarm and what they're going to do. So in my beekeeping, I have kind of subverted that urge by keeping large hives all the time, so that at the end of the winter, my bees look at the hive and say, oh, we're never going to fill up this year. We're not going to worry about swarming. And so I have an extremely low swarming rate. However,
I go just the opposite direction. I want them to swarm. I want them to win no matter what the forage situation is that year. If I can keep it so that the hives don't go 6 boxes high, we're probably going to make it through the winter then.
So what happens with hobbyist beekeepers is they follow the example of the commercial beekeepers. And since the commercial beekeepers can't haul around, however many supers they need to haul around, they keep their supers in the location where they get their honey, which is, maybe in South Dakota or somewhere where they're harvesting honey from clover. And so when they move their hives from South Dakota to Florida or Texas or somewhere to overwinter so they can be ready for pollination in California in January or February, they don't bring their supers with them. And so everybody has this idea that a hive should be 2 deeps. And so at the end of winter, after everybody has taken off their supers and stored them for the winter, the bees take a look at this double deep hive and go, oh yeah, we can swarm this year. This will be fine. We can fill this up.
Yeah.
And so no matter how many supers people stack on top of their hives every year, there's always the same problem, quote unquote problem, with swarming happening, because the bees have already decided that they're going to swarm, and that's just what's going to happen. And people not being in tune with what's going on there are going to have swarming no matter what they do. And then we get into all sorts of nonsense with trying to stop swarming and cutting out queen cells, which is always a terrible idea, and that sort of thing.
But what you're bringing up, Solomon, is really, it's accurate. It's a policy that we're using, a method that we're using that's based on a false premise to begin with. Migratory beekeeping is not natural beekeeping. So yeah, schlepping them around and having the different things for them to be foraging from and how they winter over, it's completely different than hobbyist beekeeping with the bees in one place.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I can't say it enough. If you're not a commercial beekeeper, then don't keep bees like a commercial beekeeper, especially if you're doing it for your own enjoyment, which it should be primarily. The purpose of beekeeping is to enjoy it, because any other purpose and you're going to start causing problems rather than doing what I hear so often is, I want to help the bees. So I'm starting beekeeping, and I want to tell people that's not the number one thing that can help the bees. The number one thing that can help the bees is natural habitat, and that starts with not cutting down bee trees. If at all possible, I hear people, I'd like to trap this hive out of this tree.
Oh God!
No, leave them alone.
Please stop. I know I have that conversation all the time with people who call about swarming, although it's not always swarming. Sometimes it's just, oh my God, I have a tree in the backyard with bees in it. Can you come and get them out? It's like, are you kidding? Do you have anybody do you have a garden? Do you have anybody in your neighborhood has a garden? You are now in charge of protecting these pollinators that are making sure that you and all your neighbors have tomatoes and watermelon. It's like, this should be like a heightened responsibility rather than trying to take them out. Yeah, I'm with you a whole bit. And I tell people, and they say, yeah, I'm thinking of getting into beekeeping because I want to help save the bees. And I say, be a gardener then. Go big, good forage, and grow stuff in your garden that bees will be able to pollinate and get nectar from, and don't use any chemicals, and tell your neighbors to do the same. That's how you're going to help the bees.
Plant a bunch of lavender in your flower bed or your garden.
Yeah. We don't need a whole lot of new amateur beekeepers screwing it up. I mean, if you want to, great, go ahead, do it, but do it treatment free and do it clean and learn why and how to do it. But bigger than that, if you want to help bees, really it comes down to become a good gardener and give the bees places to go. They'll come find you.
I feel that so much of what's wrong with beekeeping in this country, in the West in general, is the loss of the way it used to be with internships, what's the word I'm trying to think of? Apprenticeships, where people went to someone and said, I would like to watch you and learn how to do this thing.
That's how we teach here on the farm. We do apprenticeships.
And so we have in this country now, and this is one of those things that happens this time of year also, is people basically buy their way into it. And I think that's just really the wrong approach. But there's, I have a limited platform myself is to tell people to slow down and wait and find out first and study first and learn first before you decide that the proper way to start this thing is to plop down $200 or $300 for a starter kit and $200 for packaged bees. And, you're really setting yourself up for failure in a lot of ways. And it's really, you're lucky to survive that process. I mean, just lucky. And I don't even believe in luck, but to make it through that way of starting beekeeping in this day and age is just luck.
I totally agree with you. And I think for beginner beekeepers, any of them who have a hive that actually winters over, they're in the way into the minority. And, I think I was in year 4 before I had any hives winter over. And then I think I was in, probably, a few years beyond that when I finally, for the first winter, all my hives wintered over. And I think probably at that point I had, a dozen or 14 or something, a bunch of them, and they all made it through the winter. It was like carrying on doing almost everything completely on their own with very, very little intervention or help from me, and they're making it. That's what I really feel is helping the bees, letting them be bees, not be pets.
That's another really good point. They are bees. They are not pets. They are insects. They cannot be domesticated.
Yeah, kind of a silly idea, isn't it? I mean, they get along with us, but I don't think we're meant to hover the way that I see so many people in beekeeping doing, where it's like they feel like it's like a dog that they've got to feed it or do something or brush it or give it a pill or do something every single day to their bees. It's like, leave them alone. Those bees are doing just fine. If they're good stock and if they're being raised well, then yes, leave them alone. And, I have to say I'm anti the big business of bees, because I think so many of the things that people are taught right from the get-go is just wrong. Take too much honey and feed them back sugar. It doesn't make any difference to the bees. Whoa, red flag. All these.
That's absolutely true. Well, Jacqueline, I really appreciate you coming on the podcast and talking to us about the book. The book is called Song of Increase, Listening to the Wisdom of Honeybees for Kinder Beekeeping in a Better World. And also, I'll put a link to that in the show notes. If anybody wants to find that book, it is available as an ebook, as a regular book, paperback, and also on Audible as an audio book, which you did. You were the narrator for the book.
Yep, me and Robin Wise. She did the bees parts and I did my part. Yeah, it's on Audible now even. Isn't that amazing?
I love audiobooks, and I always prefer books that are read by the author, because you just get so much more of the feeling of, it's not like watching TV. It's like, this is the person who says the thing, and they wrote the thing, and now they're telling me about the thing. And they put just a whole different emotion into the book rather than, a professional narrator.
That's cool. It's actually been in the top 10 on Amazon for, sometimes I go check and just go look, and it's been in the top 10 for audiobooks in that category. So that's really cool. There's a really cool video that my publisher made that's on the website, spiritbee.com, when you go to the book page, and it's about the book, and it's got some beautiful imagery in it. It's taken here on our farm, but some nice slow motion stuff with the bees. It's just hypnotic to watch.
Yes, I saw that on the website. That's good. And then you also mentioned preservationbeekeeping.com.
Yes. So spiritbee.com for anything related to me or the books or the videos. And I've got some old teaching video, well, not really old, but older teaching videos on there as well that you can just watch anytime. And then preservationbeekeeping.com is the site we just started to get together a group of people. So the Spirit Bee one is more about what I'm doing with bees and bees in the world. The preservation one is let's get a bunch of people together and head off in that direction with them.
And then also, what was the name of the group that I came and spoke to last year?
Oh, the Clark County Beekeepers.
Right, Clark County Beekeepers Association, I think it is. You can check them out if you are in southern Washington or the Portland area.
Yeah, and I'm going to be at their meeting tomorrow night, second Thursday of every month.
Awesome.
So thanks. That was nice of you to bring that up. Well, what a treat being here and hanging out with you and just having a nice long conversation, Solomon. This is the same thing we would have done had you been sitting in my living room.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I enjoyed hanging out with you and your husband, and you made good food too, and I had a lot of fun coming up there last year.
It was a pleasure having you. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. And for all of our listeners, thank you again for listening to this. If you have any questions, go to the Facebook page and you will have many hundreds of answers, probably more than you can handle. Until next time, have fun keeping bees, because if you're not having fun, you probably shouldn't be doing it.